Hello, and welcome to Between the Rows, the podcast of Glacier FarmMedia. I'm your host this week, Gord Gilmour, welcoming you to our World Soil Day episode. To celebrate the top few inches of earth that support both life itself and the entire agriculture sector worldwide, we'll be talking to a number of people about how soils are suddenly sexy. Blake Wyseth of Glacier FarmMedia's Discovery Farm will tell us why soils are such a hot topic. Mario Tenuta, a soil scientist at the University of Manitoba and National Research Council chairholder, will tell us about his efforts to promote better nutrient stewardship. And Marlo Glass of Markets Farm will give us her regular market update. But first, here's a message from our sponsor.
At your Nutrient Ag Solutions retail, we take seeds seriously. Getting it right for your farm requires the right knowledge. That's why we operate the largest retail seed trial program in Western Canada. Our local experts can provide you with advice for balancing maturity with disease traits and getting the best seed to your crop. After all, we take your harvest seriously too. Talk to your local retail today or visit nutrientagsolutions.ca.
And we're back. You're listening to Between the Rows, and I'm your host this week, Gord Gilmour. December 5th marks World Soil Day, and we're joined now by Blake Wyseth, who heads up Glacier FarmMedia's Discovery Farm applied research efforts. Blake, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Gord. Really appreciate the opportunity to be involved today.
So, soil health is suddenly a pretty hot topic. What's driving this, and how important is it becoming?
Yeah, soil health is interesting. I think, on one hand, there's nothing new under the sun. I think farmers, of course, have long been good stewards of the land that they've been given, right? And certainly there's still an interest in that. And I think that is, driving this soil health movement to a certain degree. But I think in terms of what's maybe caused it to be a hot topic thing is insofar as, farmers, like all business people, are concerned about profitability and productivity on their farm. And the interesting thing I think you see in terms of many of the practices that we associate with soil health, things that conserve our soil's ability to be productive, are also those things that are practices associated with being the most profitable and the most productive on our farm. So, in the midst of raising land costs, raising input costs, of course, farmers are concerned about that and very mindful of that. So one example, if you think of direct seeding, those practices that are trying to maximize, carbon storage, organic matter retention in the soil, of course, that's also you're going to see those benefits in the productivity of your land, increased nutrient storage, water storage, and all of those sorts of things.
And now, soil health, it's a pretty broad term. What's it actually mean sort of on the local and farm level? Where would we see this in our day-to-day lives?
Yeah, and to your point, I think soil health, of course, it's a term that I think many people inherently understand, what a healthy soil looks like, right? But it's hard to kind of define soil health in a lot of ways, right? And further to that, I think it means different things to different people and across geographies, right? So as it relates to, what I'm doing as applied research lead at the Glacier FarmMedia Discovery Farm, there are a certain soil health issues that we're dealing with, particularly. A couple of those that come to mind are saline soils, salt-affected soils. Other things might be optimizing our nutrient use efficiency on farm so that we're protecting water quality. So in that respect, again, it's important when we're thinking about soil health, I think, to consider, the regional context and regionally relevant issues.
And what about the strategies and issues that you're looking at on the Discovery Farm Langham? Can you run through some of those? What have you been up to there?
Yeah, so I'll talk about two projects specifically that I think touch on, the soil health issues. So one, as I just mentioned, is trying to deal with salt-affected soils that we certainly see in areas at the Discovery Farm Langham. So in 2020, this spring, we set up a multi-year project and we've called it our salinity project. What we're looking at here, again, to address some of these salt-affected soils, is we're looking at the establishment of perennial forages as a tool to really just maintain some above ground productivity on some of these salt-affected soils. The idea being, I guess typically what we've done on the site, of course, is, annual crop it, maybe canola, wheat, or other crops in our rotation. But certainly we see that there are some productivity challenges associated with that, right? Some challenges in getting annual crops established. So we went to the direction of perennial forages just as a tool. Most forages, as you know, have an increased tolerance to salinity. And so we chose some varieties that are particularly suited for that. And we're comparing 3 different treatments of perennial forages. So we have a halo alfalfa, we have a mix of species called a saline master blend of species, and then we also have AC saltlander. So we've seeded these treatments across a 2-acre project area, and with a multi-year project like this, we're going to be evaluating several things. Number one, certainly looking at above ground productivity. So what is our biomass potential and the value associated with that to address some of the economics. But we're also looking at what impact these forages might actually have on the soil properties at the surface. So maybe over time there will be a little bit of an impact on reducing that salt concentration at the surface. And if we're not seeing a reduction in those salt concentrations, at least hopefully we're not seeing it getting worse. As you can appreciate, when you're dealing with salt affected soils, managing the water table is such an important consideration. So by having good crop establishment, we're trying to keep that water table lower in the soils profile, so that we're not bringing those salts up to the surface.
Now, we're, in my opinion, I think, kind of on the cusp of a great wave of change in agriculture and crop production, with some of the new technology and new techniques that are on the horizon. How is that going to be kind of incorporated into this goal of soil health and productivity?
Well, I would say that the movements of soil health and precision ag tech, call it what you want, I think it's quite natural and it makes a lot of sense that they might move in tandem. One of the tremendous things that we've seen as we're seeing new and emerging technologies in the ag tech space, in the precision ag space, it gives us the ability to, of course, manage our soils at a much higher resolution than we might have been used to with in the absence of these technologies. So, as an example, again, referring to what we're doing at the Discovery Farm Langham, we've partnered with Crop Pro Consulting on our Field of Excellence project, and through them, we've mapped our whole site and delineated, different management zones, of course, related to the underlying soil properties and the influence that, topography would have on water movement in the field. And with that, we're able to, I think it improves our ability to address some of these soil health concerns. So as an example, even dealing with salinity, again, as an issue, when we're using soil mapping techniques that are tied to the properties of the soil, we can sort of zoom in on some of these issues, these saline soils as an example, and target with management practices appropriate. So maybe that means increasing our seeding rate, so that we're helping to improve our establishment. We're trying to address the increased mortality, of course, that we see in these zones. Other things that we might be looking at is, again, some certain areas in the field, perhaps, low depression areas that might have high residual nutrient levels. I'm thinking, again, in the Saskatchewan context, many of these depressions are high in sulfates because our salts are sulfate salts, usually maybe high in residual nitrates. So we can use a good soil mapping system to do variable rate fertility. So maybe we're dialing back our sulfur rates, we're dialing back our nitrogen rates. And again, by doing that, I think we're maybe again trying to optimize our nutrient use efficiency, so we're getting maximum uptake by our crop, and also reducing potential losses in runoff water or gaseous losses of the nutrients as well. I think there's also opportunity maybe in autonomous machinery going forward. As that movement progresses, maybe insofar as technologies where we have the swarm movement, I guess, several robots operating within the field, maybe you can again target certain areas of the field where a prescriptive practice might be appropriate to address, again, some soil health issues. So maybe one example there is, again, typically we don't necessarily associate tillage with a practice associated with soil health, right? But I think, again, as we understand soil health more, and we realize that, it's probably more complicated than we think at certain times, maybe tillage is a practice that we need in certain instances. An example I'll give there is what we're doing with another project at Discovery Farm, our water management project, where we're trying to look at what management practices farmers can use to optimize their nutrient use efficiency, again, protect water quality. But maybe prescriptive tillage might be a strategy, as we know, with crop residues that are high sources of dissolved phosphate. Perhaps by incorporating some of that residue in a shallow layer in the soil, it'll help retain that phosphate, so we're not losing it in runoff water. So yeah, those are a few examples I can think of.
So I'm gonna end then with one kind of unfair question. I'm gonna ask you to dust your crystal ball off. And where do you see this whole question of soil health and conservation playing out over, say, the next decade or two in Western Canada? What are going to be the big trends that you're going to be watching?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think the other important consideration that we haven't touched on so far in our conversation is, of course, the influence that the consumer has nowadays in, driving public policy, in driving regulatory actions, and in driving management practices on the farm. As you know, consumers are demanding certain characteristics of their products nowadays, right? And so I think we can view the farmers can view this really as an opportunity, I think, to really address some of these needs that our consumers have in our products. So I think that will continue to be important going forward. So I think we've already seen there's certain retailers, certain ingredient companies that are having sustainability protocols attached to contracts for grain deliveries and that sort of thing. I can only anticipate that becoming more prevalent going forward. But again, the nice thing, and I think the hope that a lot of farmers can have, is what I mentioned at the start of our conversation, is I think not always, but in a lot of cases, those same practices that we're trying to, that are often associated with soil health, as an example, are the same practices that are really trying to optimize our productivity on the land. So I think in some cases, it can definitely be a win-win situation.
That's great. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, Blake.
Oh, thanks so much, Gord. Really appreciate the invitation to be involved.
That was Blake Wyseth, Director of Research and Demonstration at Glacier FarmMedia's Langham, Saskatchewan Discovery Farm, telling us about how soil health is gaining new profile. You're listening to a special edition of Between the Rows, marking World Soil Day. I'm your host, Gord Gilmour. In a few minutes, we'll hear from Marlo Glass of Markets Farm, who will fill us in on the latest from the commodities world. But we're joined now by Professor Mario Tenuta. He's a University of Manitoba professor and NSERC research chair who's worked tirelessly in recent years to promote better and more profitable management of crop nutrients. Mario, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks, Gord, for having me on your show today.
So what is 4R nutrient stewardship? I think we've all heard the term, but what's it actually look and feel like, especially at the farm level?
Well, it really is, the look and feel of it, I like that, is to use nutrients the best way possible. It doesn't mean that we're always going to be following the same recipe. Actually, we don't expect it to follow the same recipe. It's supposed to be flexible with field conditions, moisture conditions, temperature, what implements and equipment available to the farmer. But it's really about using the nutrients the best way possible for a field and for a farmer. And that involves considering the rate of the application of the nutrient, the placement or where it goes, and ideally it's to optimize the plant availability and reduce losses. The source of the nutrient, which can be with phosphorus and with nitrogen. There's multiple options of different types of nitrogen and phosphorus to use, and they have different implications in terms of losses and availability to plants. And the last is when you put it on. And obviously we like to put it on to coincide best with plant uptake, but we can play with that because of weather conditions and opportunities for labor and be able to get onto the land. So there's lots of flexibility in there, but I call it a framework which allows a farmer and consultant to think about all these factors and integrate them and come up with the best approach for that crop season.
So then what are the benefits? And I guess that's kind of a two-part question. The benefits for the farmer and then the agriculture sector as a whole.
Yeah, the benefits for a farmer are multiple. And of course, farmers know the better they use their fertilizer in terms of getting more of it into the crop and to stimulate yield, but not keep putting on fertilizer to the point where there's not much gain or return for that input. They know to stop. So farmers know there's an economics with nutrient management. And 4Rs from a farmer's perspective is really about that economics. Okay, so it tries to reduce the end losses and ensure that the amount of nutrients available and when it's available coincides with what the plant needs. So we're not shorting the plant in terms of nutrients, but we're also not putting on nutrients that are not giving an economic return back. Okay, so a lot of this sounds like nutrient management 101 from the 1950s when we started really using fertilizers. So it really hasn't changed, and so that's a key thing for the farmer is, I think, that is the economics, and there's a lot of involvement with that in terms of considerations for a farmer. And one which I'm more and more thinking about is the rate component. The rate, I think, has been this component of the 4Rs or nutrient management that seems bizarre, but I think we take it for granted. We think that you get a soil test and boom, there's your rate, or this is what you did last year. You bump it up a little bit because you're using a new hybrid or variety that has a little bit better yield potential. Whereas we don't really pay the attention to the rate for a field and fine tune it. In other words, I don't think we're doing enough in-field testing on our own to really gauge those rates and if they're paying back. And then the other thing is that we are using new approaches to, let's say, for placement or the sources, and we haven't really thought enough, I think, about do we have to change the rates because of that? Okay, and all these things, in the bottom line is, though, it can save farmer money. Now, I realize, in the big picture of things, fertilizer is relatively inexpensive. Here's a researcher saying that, whereas a farmer forking over, $100,000 in fertilizer bill, it can be, that doesn't seem very cheap, but relatively speaking, in terms of the cost of the fertilizer for some commodities like canola, there's quite a big difference. So, and I do think, though, that we can still economically do better in terms of how we use that fertilizer, in terms of saving some money, or in other cases, boosting that yield and getting return. So from a farmer's perspective, that is a key thing. And you said then, what was the other one? What is the other perspective?
The whole sector overall, and particularly, I'm wondering, will this affect sort of the sustainability model of the agriculture sector? How does it sort of make us look publicly?
Yeah, that's a good question. Publicly, sometimes I get discouraged because with the public perception, because at times, the nuances and the details seem to get lost in how we convey things to the public. And frankly, I'm not sure the public has that much time to think about all the nuances and things like that. But there is an important story and a message that we need to convey, and that is the industry and farmers together are working to use nutrients more appropriately and better. Okay, and I think this is important because the public thinks that fertilizer use or nutrient use can cause problems for the environment. So I think that's up front and center for many in the public. And sometimes I see things, or especially in documentaries and various other things like that, and I see that they portray us as just having no consideration in terms of what we're doing out in the field with things, and that's wrong, completely wrong, of course. And 4Rs really is to sit down and think about the nutrient application and do it the best way possible with a reduction of end losses to the environment. So this is really important. And really, in terms of those end losses, they come in three ways. A reduction in terms of ammonia volatilization, which is a big deal, really, that we overlook in terms of if we're putting fertilizer on the surface, either broadcasting foliar application, leaving at the surface, and then the nitrous oxide and denitrification losses, which are a big deal environmentally for N2O and also for economically for a farmer in terms of denitrification. And then there's leaching in terms of some areas, particularly where we have sandy soils, and where we can have nitrates move to the groundwater, and that can be problematic, especially for those that are dependent on using groundwater for drinking water, right, on well water. So these are, and even municipalities that are using well water for their drinking source, because they have to get rid of the nitrates and it costs money. So by using the 4Rs, it's a means, and our research shows this. There's a reduction in environmental losses of nitrogen to the environment. So that's, to me, it's a no-brainer in terms of the public good with using 4Rs. And so it's a very, very good, important message to get out to the public, that the industry and farmers are being proactive here. They're not, there's no, like in Europe, to get things done in Europe, it's legislation, regulations. The 4Rs, I'm pretty proud of us here with the 4Rs, in that, it's being adopted, it's being used, being promoted through the industry and our ag sector. And that's great. It's a volunteer uptake because it makes economic sense, and it makes good stewardship sense, responsible stewardship sense. So that's pretty cool.
For sure.
Is that a little bit long-winded for you?
No, not at all. The other thing I wonder too is I see a lot of people, they're very interested in kind of the umbrella term soil health, and that's great. I think anytime people are interested in soil health, that's nothing but a good thing. How does that mesh with this 4R philosophy?
Well, they go hand in hand. Soil health is really awesome. It is the whole concept of soil health and making it a priority. One of the priorities in production, crop production, is not just crop production, but livestock production, is a way of the future. It's not just a one way of the future, but it's really going to be more and more important. I really like it as a unifying approach to fostering sustainable productivity of our lands and management. I think it's just fantastic. So you talk to anybody, a researcher or farmer, and they're going to tell you that, hey, productivity of the land is going to be dependent on the fertility. And you can have different approaches on how you maintain fertility, right? You can be an organic producer and dependent on biological means and maybe recycling of organic wastes and things like that. You can be more on the mainstream side, use of synthetic fertilizers, and in betweens you can be using rotations with nitrogen fixing crops and so forth like that. And you're not going to have soil health with poor fertility. Your crops the productivity will be reduced. And the key thing about soil health is having very productive crops and cover crops or nurse crops or whatever you want to call these other crops that we're not harvesting and marketing. We need high productivity because the high productivity will mean they'll take up the nutrients and they have less chance for leaking and loss. But then also you have an input of organic carbon. We're feeding the soil. We're feeding the soil organisms. You're not going to feed the soil organisms if you starve the plants of nutrients. So 4Rs is part and parcel of soil health. And you can use the 4Rs in an organic production approach, the right time, placement, source, and what's the other one? Help me out. Rate. Rate. You can apply those as well to organic systems, for example. Okay, and it fits in with regenerative agriculture. It's part and parcel, as I said. And you're not going to build, let's say, soil organic matter, crop diversity, and then all those good things that come from that with other management changes, such as improved soil structure, organic matter, disease suppression. These things are dependent on having really, really appropriate soil fertility. So.
Yeah, it sounds like a very interesting picture as it evolves. Mario, thanks for taking the time to talk to us today. Much appreciated.
No problem, Gord. I hope you're having fun in the confines of your living room.
Well, that's about all any of us can do today. Thanks again.
All right, take care. Bye now.
That was Mario Tenuta of the University of Manitoba telling us about how nutrient management and soil health are inextricably linked. You're listening to a World Soil Day edition of Between the Rows, the podcast of Glacier FarmMedia. I'm this week's host, Gord Gilmour. Now we're joined by Marlo Glass of Markets Farm, who'll make sense of the markets for us. Marlo, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
One thing that you'd mentioned as we were preparing for this is that there's been a bit of labor strife disrupting Latin American soybeans. What's going on with that?
Argentina's oilseed workers and grain inspectors have started striking today, which is Tuesday, and there's no limit on this strike. It's for an indeterminate amount of time, and that could potentially jeopardize the flow of grains from the region. And that's really important for soybean prices because Argentina ships because Argentina ships quite a few soybeans. So workers have been continuing to campaign for higher pay due to riskier working conditions during the pandemic. Now, global soybean prices have also been rising quite rapidly this year, and so workers are trying to make sure that they have a piece of that pie as well.
It's not exactly been an easy season for Latin American soybeans, from what I hear. I've been seeing reports, like Brazil's been buying soybeans, which is a bit like sending coal to Newcastle, and then also reports that their producers pre-sold a lot of beans and they're kind of missing out on these market highs. What's been happening there?
That's for sure. So the importing the soybeans is really interesting, and I believe that's because they had pre-sold many soybeans, and then some typical rains have failed to materialize in pretty key growing regions of Brazil, and so they're then importing to make sure that their domestic coverage is all topped up. So that they can fulfill their export requirements and also have enough soybeans to go around in the country. So that's a very interesting development that we will be watching quite closely.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us today, Marlo.
Thanks for having me.
That was the latest from the commodity markets with Marlo Glass of Markets Farm. That's the end of our World Soil Day edition of Between the Rows. I'm your host, Gord Gilmour, saying so long, and we hope you'll join us again next week.
At your Nutrien Ag Solutions retail, we take seed seriously. Getting it right for your farm requires the right knowledge. That's why we operate the largest retail seed trial program in Western Canada. Our local experts can provide you with advice for balancing maturity with disease traits and getting the best seed to your crop. After all, we take your harvest seriously too. Talk to your local retail today or visit nutrienagsolutions.ca.
The music at today's show featured Coming Back by Lobo Loco and Earth and Sun. We also featured Leading Me On by Derek Clegg.